The alarm on my wrist did not blink. It screamed. I was standing in a quiet records office on the edge of the lunar compact, sorting old trade files, when the message tore through every screen in the building at once. Red letters. No sound effects. Just red letters that said Earth versus Galactic Assembly, and under that, a single line that made my stomach drop. Ambassador Daniel Hart, report immediately. I did not even have time to ask why. 2 armed escorts from the compact security office were already walking toward me before I finished reading the message twice. Their faces told me everything I needed to know. This was not a drill. This was not a training exercise. Somewhere out there, far past the orbit of Neptune, something had gone wrong, and my name was now attached to it. I followed them down the corridor without a word. My mind was racing through every possible mistake humanity could have made. A trade dispute, a miscommunication, a misfired signal near a border zone. None of it made sense, because humanity had spent the last 11 years being careful, painfully careful. We had barely stepped outside our own solar system. We had signed every agreement offered to us, followed every rule handed down by species that had been flying between stars since before humans learned to write. The escorts led me into a secure briefing room, where a woman I recognized immediately was already waiting. Grace Whitfield, our senior liaison to the outer compact, had a look on her face I had never seen from her before. She was afraid. I did not have long, she said, without any introduction. I need you to sit down and listen carefully, because in 6 hours, you are leaving this system, and you are going alone. I asked her what was happening. She turned the main screen toward me. A formal notice filled the display, written in the layered, ancient symbols of the Galactic Assembly, translated underneath in careful English. The words hit me harder than I expected. Humanity was being charged, not accused in a minor dispute, not summoned for a routine review. Charged, formally, before the highest court known to exist among the stars, with crimes against galactic stability. The notice did not list the details. It only said that all evidence would be presented during the trial itself, and that a single representative of Earth was required to appear in person to answer for the species. I asked her who decided this. She said the request had come from the Herald Caste, an ancient order that served the assembly by delivering judgments no one was permitted to ignore. Refusing to appear was not an option. If no representative came, the assembly would rule in absence, and a ruling made in absence against a species this young, this untested, this unprotected, could mean anything. Isolation, restriction, or worse. I remember asking her, quietly, why me? She said my name had been chosen by the Herald Caste itself, not by any human authority. That detail alone should have worried me more than it did. I did not have time to think about it. The shuttle was already being prepared. 6 hours later, I stood alone in a departure bay that suddenly felt too large and too quiet. My personal belongings had been reduced to a single case. My orders were simple and impossible at the same time. Represent Earth. Answer whatever is asked. Do not embarrass humanity in front of a galaxy that has never had to take us seriously. No one from Earth's government came to see me off. There had not been time to organize anything official, and frankly, I do not think anyone believed a single ambassador could matter much against an accusation this large. I boarded the shuttle with a folder of history files, a translator implant behind my ear, and the growing understanding that I might be the last human many of these alien species ever spoke to, depending on how this trial ended. The flight out of the solar system took less time than it should have. The shuttle was not human-built. It had been sent by the assembly itself, a smooth, dark vessel that folded space in ways our own scientists were still trying to understand. I sat alone in a cabin built for a body shape that was not mine, watching the stars stretch and blur outside a window that seemed to breathe rather than simply exist. I tried to prepare. I read through every first contact report humanity had ever filed. I studied every treaty, every trade agreement, every small diplomatic exchange we had managed since the day the first alien vessel entered our system 11 years earlier. I searched for anything that could explain a charge this serious. I found nothing. Humanity had made mistakes, certainly, the way any young species makes mistakes when learning a new and much larger world, but nothing that matched the weight of the words, crimes against galactic stability. Somewhere during the long silence of that flight, I found the file on New Meridian. New Meridian was a small human colony, barely 5 years old, sitting on the edge of a system far outside familiar territory. It had been settled quietly, without much attention, by a group of scientists and their families, under the leadership of a colony administrator named Henry Voss. I remembered the name faintly from old reports. A steady, careful man, known for avoiding conflict wherever possible. 8 months ago, New Meridian had reported an incident. A large alien vessel had entered their system without warning and attempted to claim mining rights over the colony's only water source, citing an old territorial law that predated human contact entirely. When the colonists refused to abandon their settlement, the vessel had responded with force. Henry Voss and his people had defended themselves using the limited resources available to a young colony, and the alien vessel had eventually withdrawn. At the time, the incident had barely made the news back home. It was treated as a border dispute, resolved quickly and quietly. I remembered reading the summary once and thinking little of it. Now, staring at the file again with a very different kind of fear settling into my chest, I understood. This was it. This was the seed of whatever charge now sat over the entire human species. Somewhere in that quiet, forgotten border dispute, an entire galaxy had found a reason to put humanity on trial. The shuttle began to slow as we approached our destination. Outside the window, a structure came into view that made every fear I had been holding on to shrink into something smaller and colder. It was not a planet. It was not a station, in the way humans understood the word. It was an object built across generations by a dozen different species, layered in architecture that did not belong to any single culture, stretching so far into the dark that its edges disappeared into shadow long before my eyes could find them. This was the seat of the Galactic Assembly. This was where every major decision affecting known space had been made for longer than human civilization had existed. And somewhere inside that vast, ancient structure, I was about to stand alone, an answer for every human being who had ever lived. The shuttle docked without a sound. A door opened onto a corridor bathed in soft, cold light, and for a moment, I simply stood there, unable to make my legs move. Then I remembered Grace's voice, and Henry Voss's careful reports, and the quiet weight of 8 billion people, who had no idea their entire future now depended on the next few hours. I picked up my case. I stepped off the shuttle. There was no one there to greet me. No welcoming party. No translator waiting with kind words. Only a long corridor stretching ahead into the heart of the structure, lit just enough to see the next 100 steps and no further. I took a breath, and I started walking. Behind me, the shuttle doors closed with a sound like a held breath finally released, sealing off any easy way back. Ahead of me lay a courtroom built by beings who had never once needed to explain themselves to anyone, about to sit in judgment over a species they had already decided, quietly, was too young, too dangerous, or too small to matter. I did not know yet how wrong they were. I only knew that whatever waited at the end of that corridor, I would be the only human voice in the room, and there would be no second chance to get it right. The corridor ended in a chamber so large that my mind refused to measure it properly. Rows of seats rose in circles around a central floor, filled with delegates from species I had only ever seen in old first contact photographs. Some had skin like polished stone. Some moved on clusters of thin legs that clicked softly against the floor. Some hovered slightly above their seats, wrapped in shifting clouds of pale light. Every single one of them turned to look at me the moment I stepped onto the floor. I had expected fear. What I felt instead was a strange, heavy stillness, as if my body understood that panic would not help me here, and had decided to shut it down before it could take over. A tall figure stood at the center platform, robed in deep silver, its face unreadable beneath a smooth, featureless mask. This, I would later learn, was the presiding herald, the one who had summoned me by name. Its voice, when it spoke, did not seem to come from its mouth at all. It filled the chamber evenly, calm and without emotion. "Ambassador of Earth," it said, "you stand before the Galactic Assembly to answer formal charges brought against your species. Do you understand the weight of what is asked of you here?" "I understand," I said, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Then let the charges be read," the herald said, and stepped back. Another figure rose from the circle of seats, thin and pale, its 4 eyes fixed on me without blinking. It introduced itself only as the prosecutor of the tribunal, speaking on behalf of the assembly itself. Humanity stands accused, it began, of unprovoked and disproportionate violence against a lawful claimant, of psychological terrorism against a peaceful negotiating party, and of actions that threaten to destabilize the natural order maintained by this assembly for over 4,000 cycles. The words landed in the chamber like stones dropped into still water. I heard soft murmurs ripple through the rows of delegates. I kept my face still, even as my mind scrambled to understand exactly what I was being accused of. I asked, as calmly as I could manage, for the assembly to explain what incident these charges referred to. The prosecutor gestured, and a projection bloomed in the air above the central floor. I recognized it immediately. New Meridian. The small human colony on the edge of nowhere, its modest structures glowing faintly against the dark. 8 months ago, the prosecutor continued, a lawful claimant species approached the colony, known as New Meridian, to assert territorial rights over a water source, rights recognized under galactic precedent for over 2,000 cycles. Human colonists, led by an individual identified as Henry Voss, refused to comply and responded with direct force, causing significant harm to a peaceful negotiating vessel and its crew. I felt something tighten in my chest. Peaceful negotiating vessel, that was not the story I had read in the files during my flight. I asked to see the full record of the incident, not just the summary presented by the prosecution. The presiding herald allowed it. The projection shifted, showing security footage recovered from New Meridian's own systems. I watched the alien vessel arrive without warning, watched it broadcast a demand rather than an offer, watched it begin lowering equipment toward the colony's water source before any response had even been given. I watched Henry Voss appear on the recording, his voice tired but firm, asking the vessel to withdraw and open proper negotiations first. I watched the vessel ignore him entirely and continue its approach. Only then, only after repeated warnings, did the colony's small defense systems activate. When the footage ended, I turned back to the chamber. With respect, I said, this recording shows a colony that repeatedly asked for peaceful negotiation before taking any action at all. It does not show unprovoked violence. It shows a group of people protecting the only water source that kept them alive, after being ignored and threatened first. A ripple of sound moved through the chamber again, sharper this time. The prosecutor's 4 eyes narrowed slightly. Ambassador Hart, it said, you misunderstand the nature of galactic law. Territorial claims under assembly precedent do not require negotiation once properly filed. The claimant species acted entirely within its rights. Your colonists had no lawful basis to resist. I stood there for a moment, letting that sink in. No lawful basis to resist. I understood then, more clearly than any briefing document could have explained, exactly what kind of galaxy I had walked into. A galaxy where an old law, written thousands of years ago, by species who had never needed to fight for anything, could simply erase a family's right to defend the water, keeping their children alive. I chose my next words carefully, because I understood that everything I said now would be remembered. Where I come from, I said, when someone threatens the survival of your family, of your children, of the people depending on you, you do not check a filing first. You protect them. That is not a crime. That is the most basic responsibility any living being has toward the ones it loves. The presiding herald tilted its masked head slightly, as if trying to process something unfamiliar. Explain, it said. This assembly has maintained peace for 4,000 cycles precisely because no species is permitted to act outside lawful process, regardless of circumstance. If we allowed exceptions for perceived threats, the balance we have built would collapse entirely. I looked around the chamber, at rows of ancient, powerful species who had clearly never once needed to fight for their own survival, protected for thousands of years by treaties and laws layered so deep that violence itself had become almost theoretical to them. Then perhaps, I said, that balance was never tested against a species that still remembers what it means to almost lose everything. The chamber went quiet in a different way this time, not hostile, uncertain. The prosecutor recovered quickly, its voice sharpening. Sentiment is not evidence, Ambassador. The assembly does not judge based on emotional appeal. We judge based on established precedent and documented harm. And documented harm exists here. The claimant vessel suffered significant damage. Crew members were injured. This is fact. regardless of how you frame the intention behind it. I felt a flicker of something sharper than fear now. Frustration, maybe, or the beginning of understanding just how deep this was going to go. I do not deny that harm occurred, I said. I am not here to pretend that violence has no cost, even in defense. But I would ask this assembly to consider something. If a species has never once had to defend itself in 4,000 cycles, is that because your laws are just? Or is it because your laws have simply never been tested by anyone with a good enough reason to test them? A voice from the rows above interrupted before the prosecutor could respond. A new delegate rose, this one with a long, sleek body covered in soft plating that shifted color as it moved. Its voice, when it spoke, was quieter than the prosecutor's, almost thoughtful. Presiding Herald, if the assembly permits, I would ask the ambassador a direct question. The herald nodded once. Proceed. The delegate turned toward me, its shifting plating settling into a calm, steady blue. Ambassador Hart, it said, do you believe your colonists were justified in causing harm to preserve their own survival, even against a species with far greater strength and far older claim to lawful process? I did not hesitate. Yes, I said. Not because strength or age makes something right, but because survival is not something any living being should be required to negotiate away. If your law says otherwise, then perhaps it was written by beings who forgot what it feels like to fear losing everything. The blue-plated delegate studied me for a long moment, before returning to its seat without another word. I could not tell if I had gained an ally or simply confused someone enough to stay quiet. The presiding herald raised a hand, and the chamber settled into stillness once more. This tribunal will recess, it announced, before continuing to matters of historical record concerning the species known as humanity. I felt my stomach drop again. Historical record. I understood immediately what that meant. They were not finished with New Meridian. They intended to use humanity's entire past as evidence against us. Every war, every conflict, every dark chapter buried in our long and complicated history, laid bare before a galaxy that had already decided we were dangerous. As the chamber began to empty for recess, the blue-plated delegate approached me quietly, its plating shifting to a softer, almost curious shade of green. You spoke without fear in there, it said. Few species do, when facing this assembly for the first time. I did not feel as brave as I looked, I admitted. The delegate tilted its head in a gesture I could not quite interpret, something between amusement and respect. Perhaps that is precisely why it mattered, it said, before turning and moving away into the thinning crowd, leaving me alone once more in a chamber that no longer felt quite as empty of hope as it had when I first walked in. I stood there a moment longer, watching the ancient beings of 1,000 worlds file out around me, each one carrying judgment over my entire species in their unreadable eyes. Somewhere far behind me, 8 billion people were sleeping, working, laughing, completely unaware that their fate was being decided in a room they would never see, by a single tired ambassador who had not slept in almost a full day. I picked up my case, straightened my shoulders, and prepared myself for whatever came next, because I understood now, with painful clarity, that the real trial had not even begun. The recess lasted only long enough for me to drink something warm and bitter that a quiet attendant placed in my hands without a word of explanation. I did not ask what it was. I simply needed something to hold on to while my thoughts settled. When the chamber doors opened again, I walked back in, already knowing this next stretch of the trial would be worse than the first. The presiding herald waited until every delegate had returned to their seats before speaking again. This tribunal will now examine the broader historical pattern of the species known as humanity, it announced, in order to determine whether the New Meridian incident reflects an isolated event or a deeper tendency toward instability. I understood immediately what this meant. They were not simply going to judge one colony's decision to defend itself. They were going to place my entire species on the table, cut it open, and search through every scar we had ever earned trying to survive on our own small, difficult world. The prosecutor rose again, its 4 eyes gleaming faintly under the chamber's cold light. Ambassador Hart, it began, the Assembly has compiled a record of your species' history spanning several thousand of your years. We find repeated instances of large-scale conflict between your own people, long before any contact with outside species occurred. Wars fought over land, over belief, over resources, often resulting in significant loss of life among your own kind. A projection bloomed above the floor, cycling silently through old images, battlefields, ruined cities. Faces frozen in old photographs, captured in moments of grief that had nothing to do with aliens or galactic law, only with humanity's long and painful relationship with itself. This pattern, the prosecutor continued, suggests a species with a deeply ingrained tendency toward conflict, one that predates any outside provocation. The Assembly must consider whether granting such a species access to the wider galaxy poses an unacceptable risk to the stability we have maintained for millennia. I felt the weight of thousands of alien eyes settle on me, waiting to see how I would respond to seeing my own history used as a weapon against me. For a moment, I said nothing at all. I simply let the images finish their slow, silent cycle above the chamber floor. "You are right," I said finally, and I watched surprise ripple through several rows of delegates. "Humanity has fought many wars. We have hurt each other, deeply and often, across thousands of years. I will not stand here and pretend otherwise, because pretending would insult every person who lived through those times, and every person still living with the consequences today." The prosecutor's eyes narrowed slightly, clearly expecting a denial rather than agreement. "But I would ask this assembly to look a little further into that same history," I continued, "because war is not the only thing you will find there." I gestured, and with the herald's quiet permission, my own small collection of records began to project beside the prosecutor's images. Not battlefields this time, hospitals built in the middle of ongoing conflicts, staffed by people risking their own lives to save strangers from the opposing side. Rescue teams pulling survivors from collapsed buildings after natural disasters, working through exhaustion, because stopping was never an option while someone remained trapped. Long lines of ordinary people donating blood, food, shelter, and time to others they had never met and would likely never meet again. "For every war humanity has fought," I said, "we have built 10 times as many things meant only to heal what war broke. For every conflict recorded in your files, there are countless untold stories of people choosing kindness, even when cruelty would have been easier. We are not a species defined only by our worst moments. No species should be." A murmur moved through the chamber, quieter this time, more thoughtful than hostile. The prosecutor pressed forward anyway. "Noble sentiment," it said, "but sentiment does not erase pattern. Your species has repeatedly demonstrated the capacity for large-scale violence against itself. How can this assembly trust that such violence will not eventually turn outward, toward species less capable of matching human aggression?" I felt something shift inside me then, not anger exactly, but a steady, clear resolve. "Because every single time humanity faced true catastrophe," I said, "the kind that could have ended us completely, we did not turn on each other in the end. We turned toward each other. When plagues swept across our world and killed millions, we built medicine together and shared it freely, even with those we had once called enemies. When famine threatened entire regions, ships from nations who had fought wars against each other, only years earlier, carried food to save lives they had no obligation to save. Humanity's history is not simply a story of conflict, it is a story of a species that keeps choosing, again and again, to endure together rather than fall apart." The chamber remained quiet for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, a new voice rose from the upper rows, sharp and challenging. "Then let us test that claim directly," it said. I turned to see a heavy-set delegate rising from its seat, its thick gray hide marked with old scars that told their own silent history. It introduced itself simply as a representative of the Velimar people, a species I recognized faintly from old trade records but knew almost nothing about personally. "Ambassador," the Velimar delegate said, "my people have crossed paths with humanity before, under circumstances your species conveniently failed to mention to this assembly." I felt a small flicker of unease. I had no idea what it was about to say. "Decades ago," it continued, "our homeworld suffered a plague unlike anything we had faced in our recorded history. Our medical technology, advanced as it was, could not contain it. Millions of our people were dying, and every species with the ability to help chose distance instead, fearing contamination, or simply finding no benefit in risking themselves for a struggling species they barely knew." The chamber had gone very still now, every delegate listening closely. "Humanity was not yet a member of this assembly," the Velimar delegate said. "Humanity had no formal obligation to us at all. And yet a small relief fleet arrived at our homeworld, within weeks of the outbreak becoming known, carrying medical supplies, doctors, and equipment that ultimately allowed us to develop a cure before the plague could wipe out half our population. I felt my chest tighten with something between relief and disbelief. I had never heard this story before. It had happened long before my own posting, buried somewhere in old records that had clearly never made it into common knowledge, human or otherwise. The prosecutor moved to interrupt, but the presiding herald raised a hand, silencing it. "Continue," the herald said quietly. The Velimar delegate nodded once. "I share this not out of sentiment," it said, "but because this assembly claims to judge based on pattern and evidence. If humanity's pattern includes turning on itself in conflict, it also includes crossing the void to save a species it owed nothing to, expecting nothing in return. I believe this assembly owes humanity the honesty of considering both patterns equally, not only the one that suits the prosecution's argument." The chamber erupted into low, urgent conversation, dozens of delegates speaking quietly among themselves. I stood at the center of it all, feeling something shift beneath the surface of the trial for the first time since I had arrived. The presiding herald allowed the murmuring to continue for a long moment before raising both hands for silence. "This tribunal acknowledges the Velimar testimony as relevant historical record," it announced. "The prosecution will address why this information was not included in the original case presented to this assembly." The prosecutor's composure slipped, just slightly, its 4 eyes flicking toward the herald before settling back on me. "This tribunal draws its evidence from established assembly archives," it said carefully. "Any omission was unintentional." I did not believe that for a second, and judging by the murmurs still moving through the chamber, I was not the only one. I decided, in that moment, to press the advantage while it still existed. "If this tribunal intends to judge humanity fairly," I said, "then I would ask that every relevant record be brought forward, not only the ones that support a predetermined conclusion. My species has made mistakes. We have caused harm, sometimes to each other, sometimes through misunderstanding with species we barely knew existed. But we have also given everything we had to help others survive, expecting nothing in return, long before we ever stood before this assembly asking for anything ourselves." The presiding herald studied me for a long moment, its featureless mask giving away nothing of what it might be thinking. "This tribunal will take the Velimar testimony under formal consideration," it finally said. "Further cross-examination will resume once additional historical records have been properly reviewed." The chamber began to shift again, delegates murmuring among themselves as the session moved toward another recess. I felt exhaustion settling deep into my bones, the kind that came from holding your ground for hours against beings who had never expected you to hold it at all. As I turned to step away from the center floor, the Velimar delegate approached me directly, its scarred gray hide catching the chamber's cold light. "Why did you not know this story?" it asked, its voice quieter now, almost curious. "Why does your own species not remember what it once did for mine?" I thought about that question for a long moment before answering honestly. "Because we did not do it to be remembered," I said. "We did it because you needed help, and we were able to give it. Perhaps that is simply how humanity has always been, even when no one, including ourselves, was watching closely enough to notice." The Velimar delegate held my gaze for a moment longer, something unreadable moving behind its dark eyes, before finally stepping back and allowing me to leave the chamber floor. As I walked back into the quiet corridor outside, my legs finally trembling now that no one was watching, I understood that something important had shifted inside that room. The trial was far from over. The charges still stood. But for the first time since stepping off that shuttle, I allowed myself to believe, just slightly, that humanity might have a chance to be seen not as a threat to be contained, but as a species worth actually understanding. I did not yet know how close that fragile hope would come to being destroyed entirely by what waited in the next stage of this trial. I was given only a short time to rest before being summoned back into the chamber, and when I returned, something in the air felt different. The delegates were seated more rigidly than before. Several avoided my eyes entirely. Something had happened during the recess, something I had not been present for, and I did not like the tension I could feel pressing down on the room. The presiding herald wasted no time. "This tribunal has reviewed additional historical records," it announced, "including further testimony gathered during recess. New information has come to light that this assembly considers relevant to final judgment. I felt my pulse quicken. This did not sound like an announcement in humanity's favor. A new figure rose from the highest tier of seating, one I had not noticed before, wrapped in dark robes that seemed to absorb the chamber's light rather than reflect it. Its voice, when it spoke, was smooth and unhurried, carrying an authority that made even the presiding herald straighten slightly. I introduce myself as a senior envoy of the Thren Dominion, it said, one of the oldest recognized powers within this assembly's jurisdiction. I had read about the Thren Dominion during my flight. An ancient, powerful civilization, respected and rarely challenged, holding significant influence throughout assembly proceedings for longer than most other species had existed at all. The Thren envoy continued, its dark eyes fixed on me with an expression I could not quite place. My people have long observed humanity's rapid expansion with concern, it said. In little more than a decade, this young species has secured trade agreements, formed alliances, and demonstrated technological growth that took other civilizations many centuries to achieve. We believe this trial presents an opportunity this assembly cannot afford to overlook. I felt something cold settle in my chest. The envoy turned toward the chamber at large. I submit that humanity's rapid rise itself constitutes a threat to galactic stability, it said, regardless of individual incidents like New Meridian. A species capable of such swift growth, combined with a demonstrated willingness to use force in defense of its interests, represents a variable this assembly cannot safely allow to continue unchecked. The chamber fell silent, and I understood, with sudden and complete clarity, exactly what was happening. This was never really about New Meridian at all. That incident had simply been the excuse, the thread someone had pulled to unravel something far larger. I stepped forward before I had fully decided to speak. With respect, I said, New Meridian was presented to this assembly as the central charge against humanity. Now I am hearing that the true concern is not what my species did, but simply how quickly we have grown. I would ask this assembly, and this envoy directly, whether growth itself has ever before been treated as a crime under galactic law. The Thren envoy did not flinch. Growth without restraint has ended civilizations before, Ambassador, it said smoothly. This assembly exists precisely to prevent such outcomes. I looked around the chamber slowly, meeting as many eyes as I could. Or perhaps, I said, growth without restraint simply threatens civilizations that have grown comfortable holding power for far longer than they have earned it. A sharp murmur moved through the rows, and I saw the Thren envoy's composed expression tighten just slightly. I did not stop there. I would like this assembly to consider something, I continued. Every charge brought against humanity in this trial has centered on New Meridian, a minor border dispute that any impartial observer would recognize as self-defense. Yet now, when that argument has begun to weaken, a new and far larger concern has suddenly appeared, one that conveniently benefits a civilization already established as one of the most powerful forces in this assembly. The blue-plated delegate I had spoken with earlier rose slowly from its seat, its coloring shifting to a sharp, alert red. Presiding Herald, it said, if the ambassador's implication holds any weight, this tribunal has an obligation to investigate the origin of these charges more closely, rather than simply accepting them at face value. The Thren envoy's voice sharpened for the first time since it had begun speaking. This tribunal does not exist to entertain baseless accusations against established powers, it said, based solely on the defensive posturing of a species already under formal charge. I felt the weight of the moment pressing down on me, and I understood that whatever I said next would determine far more than my own fate. I am not asking this assembly to simply take my word for anything, I said. I am asking this assembly to do what it claims to value most, examine evidence honestly, wherever that evidence leads, even if it leads somewhere uncomfortable for those holding the most power in this room. The presiding herald raised a hand, silencing the growing murmur across the chamber. This tribunal will formally investigate the origin and timing of all charges brought against humanity, it announced, including the involvement of any outside parties in shaping this case. I saw something flicker briefly across the Thren envoy's composed expression before it settled back into stillness, but it was enough. I had seen it. So, judging by the sudden shift in murmuring around the chamber, had several others. Over the following hours, Records were pulled forward that painted a picture far different from the one originally presented. Communication logs showed that the claimant vessel involved in the New Meridian incident had been quietly funded through channels traced back to Thren interests. Older records revealed subtle diplomatic pressure applied by Thren representatives on several smaller delegate species, encouraging support for harsh judgment against humanity, long before this trial had even formally begun. None of it was a single, dramatic piece of proof. It was small pieces, gathered patiently, each one meaning little on its own, but forming a clear pattern once placed together. I realized, with quiet astonishment, that this pattern had not been built by me alone. Throughout the trial, without my fully realizing it, delegates like the blue-plated envoy and the Velimar representative had been quietly gathering support, asking careful questions during recess, sharing doubts among species who had grown tired of Thren influence, shaping outcomes long before evidence was ever properly weighed. The presiding herald allowed the full record to be reviewed, before finally addressing the chamber directly. This tribunal finds sufficient concern regarding the origin of these charges to warrant a formal vote, it announced. The Assembly will now decide whether the case against humanity, as originally presented, holds merit, or whether it reflects undue influence unrelated to genuine concern for galactic stability. The Thren envoy rose one final time, its voice controlled but noticeably tighter than before. This tribunal risks setting a dangerous precedent, it warned, allowing emotional appeal and unproven implication to override established process. I met its gaze directly, steady despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of me. Perhaps, I said quietly, the most dangerous precedent would be allowing power alone to decide judgment, rather than truth. The chamber grew still, waiting for the herald's final word, before the vote would begin. This tribunal will now prepare for closing statements, the presiding herald announced, before final judgment is cast. I felt the full weight of that moment settle over me completely. Everything humanity had built, everything we still hope to become, now rested on whatever I managed to say in the final minutes of this trial. I had no grand speech prepared, no clever strategy left to deploy. I only had the truth, plain and simple, the same truth I had carried with me since stepping off that shuttle alone. I straightened my shoulders, took a slow breath, and waited for my turn to speak one last time. The chamber settled into a silence heavier than any I had felt since arriving. Every seat was filled, every eye, every sensor, every strange and ancient form of attention this assembly possessed, was fixed on the small, tired figure standing alone at the center of the floor. The presiding herald turned toward me. "Ambassador Hart," it said, "you may now offer your closing statement before this tribunal casts final judgment upon your species." I stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch just slightly longer, not for effect, but because I needed that moment to gather everything I had left inside me. "I did not come here today expecting to be believed," I finally said. "I came here because refusing to come would have meant abandoning 8 billion people to a judgment made without them ever having a voice in the room. I still do not know if anything I have said has changed a single mind here. But I know that I told the truth, plainly, without pretending my species is something we are not." I looked slowly around the chamber, at faces both familiar and strange, allies and skeptics alike. "Humanity is not perfect," I continued. "We have hurt each other. We have made mistakes, some of them terrible, long before we ever knew another species existed among these stars. But we have also protected each other, healed each other, and reached out to help beings who owed us nothing, and expected nothing from us in return. When one of our own colonies was threatened, its people did not check an ancient law before defending the water keeping their children alive. They protected what mattered most, the same way any of you would, if you were finally forced to remember what it feels like to fear losing everything." I paused, letting that settle before continuing. "This trial began with an accusation of instability," I said. "But the deeper I have gone into these proceedings, the more I have come to understand that this was never truly about stability at all. It was about comfort. About a galaxy grown so used to peace that it forgot peace was never meant to be permission for the powerful to control the future of the powerless. Humanity is not asking this assembly for special treatment. We are only asking to be judged by the same honest standard every other species here has been given the chance to meet." I let my gaze settle finally on the presiding herald. "If this assembly rules against humanity today," I said, It will not be because we are dangerous. It will be because we refuse to stay quiet and refuse to disappear, exactly when someone else needed us to. I stepped back, finished, my voice steady even as my hands trembled slightly at my sides. The Thren envoy rose once more, offering a brief, measured closing statement about the importance of preserving established order, about the risks of allowing sentiment to override precedent. Its words were smooth, practiced, delivered with the calm confidence of a civilization used to winning arguments simply by outlasting them. When it finished, the presiding herald raised both hands, and the chamber fell into absolute stillness. This tribunal will now cast judgment, it announced. Each delegate species present shall register their decision. The matter before this assembly is simple. Does the case against humanity, as originally presented and subsequently examined, warrant formal condemnation? A soft chime echoed through the chamber as the voting began. I could not see individual results, only a slow, rising tally displayed above the central floor, climbing steadily, as delegate after delegate registered their choice. I stood perfectly still, forcing myself to breathe evenly, refusing to let my exhaustion show as the numbers continued to shift. For a long, agonizing stretch, the count remained close, almost painfully even. I thought of Henry Voss, standing on New Meridian, asking for peace before ever raising a hand in defense. I thought of Grace Whitfield back home, watching whatever signal eventually reached Earth, waiting to learn whether the species she had devoted her life to representing still had a future among the stars. I thought of every ordinary person on Earth who had no idea their entire future was balanced on a single, quiet vote taking place light years from home. Then, slowly, the tally began to shift. The blue-plated delegate's vote registered clearly against condemnation. The Velimar representative followed almost immediately after. One by one, smaller species, who had long grown weary of Thren influence, added their voices as well, some hesitant, some firm, but each one tipping the balance further away from judgment against humanity. Finally, the tally settled, and the presiding herald raised a hand for silence. This tribunal finds insufficient grounds to formally condemn the species known as humanity, it announced. The charges as originally presented are dismissed. Further investigation into the origin of undue influence within this proceeding will continue under separate review. For a moment, I could not fully process the words. Relief hit me so suddenly that my knees nearly buckled beneath me. I forced myself to remain standing, forced my face to stay composed, even as something inside me finally allowed itself to feel, just slightly, the full weight of everything I had been carrying since stepping off that shuttle alone. The Thren envoy did not rise again. It sat in rigid silence as murmurs of disbelief and quiet satisfaction moved through the chamber around it. Several delegates turned toward it, with expressions I could easily read as disappointment, even distrust, and I understood that whatever influence it had once held within these walls had been permanently, visibly damaged by what this trial had uncovered. The presiding herald addressed the chamber one final time. This tribunal formally closes, it announced. Ambassador Hart, you are free to return to your homeworld. I nodded, unable to trust my voice enough to respond properly. As the chamber slowly began to empty around me, the blue-plated delegate approached once more. Its coloring settled into a calm, steady gold. You did not simply defend your species today, it said. You reminded this assembly why judgment without honesty is no judgment at all. I managed a small, tired smile. I only told the truth, I said. The rest was decided by people willing to listen. The delegate tilted its head slightly, something like respect visible in its posture, before turning and disappearing into the thinning crowd. The Velimar representative paused briefly as well, its scarred gray hide catching the fading chamber light. Perhaps now your species will be remembered properly, it said quietly, for what it once did, and for what it did here today. I thanked it, my voice finally breaking slightly with exhaustion and relief combined, before it too stepped away, leaving me alone once more at the center of a chamber that no longer felt quite so cold. The journey home passed in a blur I barely remember, my body finally allowing itself to rest once the weight of responsibility had eased, just enough to breathe properly again. When my shuttle finally entered familiar space, when Earth appeared once more as a small, fragile blue light against the endless dark, I felt something settle deep inside me that I had not expected to feel again after everything I had witnessed. Grace Whitfield was waiting when I landed, her expression somewhere between disbelief and quiet joy. She did not ask many questions right away. She simply embraced me, briefly, the way people do when relief outweighs the need for words. Later, once I had rested enough to speak clearly, I gave my full report to the small circle of officials who had authorized my journey. I told them everything, the charges, the history dredged up against us, the quiet courage of a species willing to admit its own mistakes without losing sight of its own worth. I told them about New Meridian, about Henry Voss and his careful, tired voice, asking for peace, before ever needing to defend anything at all. I told them about the Velimar people, about a story humanity itself had forgotten, buried simply because we never thought to keep count of the good we had done. Humanity's place among the stars remained fragile. I knew that clearly enough by now. Powerful forces still existed, who saw our growth as a threat rather than an achievement. The Thren Dominion's influence had been damaged, but not destroyed, and I understood that whatever quiet grudge had been created that day would not simply disappear. But something had changed as well, something I could feel clearly, even as I stood once more on solid, familiar ground, beneath a sky I finally recognized as home. Humanity had stood alone before the oldest and most powerful court known to exist among the stars, and rather than disappearing quietly into judgment, we had been seen, truly seen, for exactly what we were. Imperfect, certainly, still learning, undoubtedly, but resilient in a way few species this young had ever managed to prove, and honest in a way few species this old had ever bothered to remain. I stood outside that evening for a long while, watching the stars begin to appear one by one across a darkening sky, knowing now that somewhere among them, an entire galaxy had finally learned humanity's name properly, not as a threat to be contained, but as a voice that refused to stay silent when everything worth protecting was on the line. Whatever challenges still waited among those distant stars, I understood one thing with complete certainty as I finally allowed myself to rest that night. Humanity was no longer simply a young species hoping quietly to be left alone. We were a species the galaxy now knew it could never again afford to underestimate.